Let's look at this spreadsheet together. You have a big financing gap for education. Half your kids aren't in school. Let's add that. You don't have obstetrical care. Oh my God, let's add that. You need some roads. I see that half the people don't have electricity. Let's add all this together. Oh, you have a gap of $27 billion a year. And since we are the UN family system to help you, we're going to help you go out to get good financing to cover that gap. That's my dream of what the IMF would do. Of course, the US would go a little crazy because the whole debate started with the US saying in 1944, we are the creditor nation, thank you, we will decide what gets lent. And that's what they told John Maynard Keynes in Bretton Woods, New Hampshire in 1944. And if you do know the geography of power in the world, 15th and Pennsylvania Avenue in Washington is the Treasury, 16th and Pennsylvania Avenue is the White House, 17th and Pennsylvania is the Executive Office Building of the President, 18th and Pennsylvania is the World Bank, and 19th in Pennsylvania is the IMF. So that's how this was created. I believe because the IMF has, I love the place, by the way. I've been spending my whole life trying to help them put the finance minister on this side and work together with them. And I've trained a large number of the staff. And I tell them often, that's not what you learned in class. So I'm trying to help them do the right thing. But that's a power situation also, obviously. So to answer your question, first of all, there is no definitive answer to this. Second, so how big approximately? Somewhere between $3 and $5 trillion a year. Okay, now, is that a lot or a little? The world output is $100 trillion a year. The world saving is $30 trillion a year. So we're talking about 3 to 5% of world GDP. And we're talking about maybe, 10% to 16.6% of global saving. Perfectly manageable. And saving isn't fixed, it could rise and so forth. So the gaps are not huge. They are quite manageable, given that these are our major global goals. And certainly the gaps for the poorest countries are not at all big. Maybe $1 trillion a year. And $1 trillion a year is 1% of world output. And if you gave me $1 trillion a year, I would be able to help every government get out of poverty. That would be enough to make investments, get all the kids in school, get health care for every person, get water and electricity connection for every person. That'd be a great start. And you could do that for $1 trillion a year for all the billion people in extreme poverty. So it's not huge. So then comes lots of detailed, interesting analytical questions. First, some of it is for rich countries, but the gap there isn't really a financing gap, it's a political choice gap. They're just not making investments, but the finance is available. Where the gap is really most consequential is for countries that cannot mobilize this out of their domestic resources. A poor country cannot afford to get all its kids in school, by the way. This is very weird, because you'd think, well, at least you can do that. But I've spent 10 years on this calculation. And if you're a low-income country, it costs between 10 and 15% of GDP for universal primary and secondary education. Very high. The reason is teachers are relatively costly in low-income countries, and there are a lot of young kids in low-income countries because they have high fertility rates. So the whole age pyramid is very wide. So there's not an African country, low-income or lower middle-income country, that can actually afford SDG 4. And that should be the most alarming fact in the world, because you cannot have economic development without your kids educated. No matter what else you do, you cannot have economic development without educated kids. So it's for the low and lower middle income countries that the crisis is biggest. There are gaps in the high income countries, but I don't worry too much about them because those are political obstacles that should be filled, but it's manageable. Upper middle income is tricky because some upper middle income countries have good access to credit, others don't have access to credit. Then there's another consideration. Sorry, and I'll come to a conclusion. Technically, what do? There are two related issues. One, how could you make capital flow at relatively low cost and long-term maturity to poorer countries? This is the major technical question on finance. If you look at the penalties that low-income countries pay to borrow, they're quite steep. You pay 10 or 15% interest rates if you are a double B borrower, sub-investment grade, compared to what a triple A or double A minus borrower pays. And why is that? Long story, and I won't go into it, but making that flatter so that for poor countries they have access to low-cost capital is crucial. One way to do that is larger multilateral development banks. This is, everybody agrees on that, though they don't agree to do it, but they agree that that's one part of the solution. More ADB, more AIIB, more new development bank, more World Bank. That requires capital increases. Capital increases mean larger voting shares for China. The United States needs to swallow, and Europe needs to swallow and get on with it. So that's one part of what needs to be done. The second part is to de-risk private capital flows. That's also a tricky set of issues. I'd say I got into that question 45 years ago as a graduate student, and it's still somewhat of a puzzle. It's a long story, but it's not impossible to do that. There's one more dimension, and because also you're from the Russian Federation, I want to mention it, and that is that there's an intrinsic link between global finance and global monetary arrangements. And global monetary arrangements mean how we settle trade. And we are, of course, in a largely dollar-based settlements system. So the monetary system is largely dollar-based, not exclusively, but about 60%. And the United States, unfortunately and unwisely, weaponized the dollar-based payment system starting about 15 years ago by seizing assets, including Russian assets recently, the $300 billion seized in 2022, but also Iran, North Korea, Afghanistan, Venezuela, and a number of others. To my mind, this is a completely unacceptable and self-defeating policy. It's cheap because the President of the United States can do it with a stroke of the pen. You don't have to ask Congress, you don't have to ask the public, you don't have to ask the UN, you don't have to ask anybody. To my mind, it's blatantly illegal and absolutely practically unwise. Because why would you use dollars if the US is going to take them away from you when they don't like what you're doing? The idea of payments is that they're reliable, not that they're political. So this is why the BRICS countries, especially under Russia's leadership this year, are negotiating non-dollar payments. And I support this entirely. But I also say to the US Treasury all the time, don't confiscate other people's money. It's not a good policy. It's not going to work. And the idea, by the way, of grabbing Russia's $300 billion for Ukraine is so illegal you don't even know where to start. But these are politicians. They're not lawyers. They're not diplomats. They're not financiers. They want quick solutions for their re-elections. So this is really a problem. But it's a problem that also has a solution because we just won't use the dollar in places where the United States policies could lead to confiscation. So all of this means we have a bit of a morass in the international financial system within our family of getting the right answers to the financing questions. There's actually one more technical point I need to mention, which is that the IMF and the World Bank have what they call the Debt Sustainability Framework, or DSF. And it's based on an arbitrary set of numbers where they say, we grade you whether you're weak, medium, or strong in debt management. And then based on your ranking, we give you a ceiling of gross debt to GDP. And the ceiling is no more than 30% debt to GDP ratio if you are a weakly governed country. This is a death certificate. This is not economic policy. Why? Because if you're a poor country, it means almost by definition you don't have electricity, you don't have paved roads, you don't have digital access, and your kids aren't in school. So what the IMF and the World Bank are telling you is, stay that way. Don't bother us. Don't borrow because you might get into debt trouble. But if you don't borrow, you won't have electricity, schools, or anything else. They don't have an alternative solution for these countries. So they're telling the countries, don't borrow. I'm telling the countries, borrow. But my advice is borrow 30-year maturity, fixed interest rates, and on reasonable terms. But where do you get those? That's where I want the G20 to come into this story to give an answer to that. But when I do, again, in my spare time, solving a growth model for how much you should borrow if you want to have your kids in school, have electricity, and so on, exactly your question, the debt actually rises to about 200% of GDP before it starts declining 30 years from now. You want to borrow a lot because you don't want to live without electricity, you don't want to live without roads, you don't want to live without educated children, you don't want to live without health facilities. So you want to borrow, but you want the borrowing to be very long-term so that you have 40 years to grow in order to repay the debt 40 years from now. The IMF has none of this intertemporal analysis because the debt sustainability framework is a 5-year snapshot. It's not a growth scenario. Now, I taught intertemporal growth for 30 years, and this is where I tell my students, you learn something, right? You borrow if the rate of return on your investment is higher than the cost of capital, and if you're not going to get into a debt crisis in the meantime. So we need to create a finance framework that can work. Final words. For this region, SCAP, there are a few countries that are seriously debt constrained or finance constrained. Most are not, but some are. For Africa, it's pervasive. The whole continent is debt constrained right now. So that's where the most serious problems are. Within this region, you have the means to solve the problem because this is a high saving region. And China has a savings surplus. That's why initiatives like the Belt and Road Initiative are wonderful. And they should really be encouraged. But the advice I give to China is when you lend for the Belt and Road Initiative, lend for 30 years. Don't lend for 10 years or 12 years. You will be disappointed and your counterpart will be very disappointed because they'll get into debt crisis. And that's what's happening right now. Not that China set a debt trap, that's propaganda. China didn't set a debt trap, it just set a maturity structure too short. And so when I speak to the Chinese finance authorities, I'm telling them 30-year loans. And nobody thinks ahead more than China. So China needs to do the same thing of looking at a 30-year perspective, and especially for the poorer countries, give much longer term loans. And for the rest of the US, unfortunately, is not a net savings surplus country, it's a net debtor country, so it can't offer much in finance anymore. But the capital markets could offer more, and we need to tap that. Sorry for the long-winded answer, but good, very good question, important question.
Who wrote in 2015, and I'll quote from the article, "Since its founding, the United States has consistently pursued a grand strategy focused on acquiring and maintaining preeminent power over various rivals, first on the North American continent, then in the Western Hemisphere, and finally globally." Well, China doesn't want the United States to be the preeminent power. It wants to live alongside the United States. Blackwell, writing in 2015, said China's rise is a threat to U.S. preeminence. And he laid out a series of steps that the Biden administration actually is following almost step by step. What Blackwell laid out already back in 2015 is that the United States should create, quote, "new preferential trading arrangements among U.S. friends and allies to increase their mutual gains through instruments that consciously exclude China. There should be a technology control regime to block China's strategic capabilities, a buildup of, quote, power political capacities of U.S. friends and allies on China's periphery, and strengthen U.S. military forces along the Asian rimland despite any Chinese opposition." This has become the Biden foreign policy. China knows it. China really is pushing back. But what's very important and interesting to understand, and we've seen it clearly in the dynamics involving the Ukraine war, most of the world also does not want the U.S. as the global preeminent power. Most of the world wants a multipolar world and is therefore not lined up behind the United States, sanctions on Russia and so forth. And this was also the message of President Lula visiting China, saying to President Xi Jinping, we as Brazil also want multipolarity, true multipolarity, and we want peace, for example, in the Russian-Ukraine war that is based on not a U.S. perception of dominance, say NATO enlargement, but rather a peace that reflects a multipolar world. This is real. It's happening all over the world. And the fact of the matter is, the reason why this is a historic watershed is that the underlying economics and technological change have made it so the U.S. is no longer the dominant world economy, and the G7, which is the U.S., Canada, Britain, France, Italy, Germany, and Japan, is actually smaller than the BRICS countries in economic size, which is Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa. So we really are, in fact, in a multipolar world, but in ideology, we're in a conflict.
But Jeffrey Sachs, I wanted to ask about that. You mentioned the BRICS. The BRICS Bank that is now in China, and President Lula has named Dilma Rousseff as the head of the BRICS Bank. Its importance in terms of this multipolarity of in the world economies, the potential for even the creation of alternative major currencies to the dollar as a result of the BRICS alliance. The impact of that on world affairs.
This is a big deal. And in fact, the United States is withdrawing. It doesn't know it necessarily. Our politicians don't understand this, but our politicians are withdrawing from the world financial and monetary scene and opening up the space for a completely different kind of international finance. I'll give you an example. The U.S. was the creator of the World Bank, but now the U.S. Congress won't put new money into the World Bank. And because of that, the World Bank's actually a quite small institution. It's got a big name, but it's a quite small institution in the financial scheme of things. The U.S. won't put more money in. The Congress says, no, why should we waste our money internationally and so forth? And you get a lot of hubbub about that. So China and the rest of the BRICS say, okay, we'll make our own development bank. And they established the new development bank, or sometimes called the BRICS Bank, based in Shanghai. And that's just one of the institutions that is really changing the scene. There's the Asia Infrastructure Investment Bank, AIIB, based in Beijing, in fact. There is, as President Lula said, and it's happening also in the context of the Ukraine war, a move away from the use of the dollar, which the United States has thought, well, that's our ace in the hole. You know, that is our ultimate hold on things, because we can use sanctions, we can use our financial control to keep other countries in line. But other countries are saying, not so much. We'll trade in renminbi, we'll trade in rubles, we'll trade in rupees, we'll trade in our own national currencies. And they're quickly setting up alternative institutions to do this. The United States doubles down. We will confiscate your reserves. We will, if you don't follow. And the other countries are saying, you know, if you want to go through the UN and get really multilateral rules, we're with you. But if you want to just impose the rules, we won't follow along. And so we have this very funny expression called a rule-based international order. The United States government uses it every day. But what does it mean? Who writes the rules? And what most of the world wants, in fact, is rules written in a multipolar or multilateral setting, not rules written by the United States and a few friends and allies.
I wanted to ask you, you've been an advisor to the United Nations for quite often. The issue of how much longer the permanent members of the Security Council can keep the number to 5, because clearly Brazil and other countries of the global south have been saying the UN needs to be reformed. And countries from Latin America, specifically Brazil and Africa, should have representation on the UN Security Council, permanent members.
Yes, you know, the P5, the permanent 5, which is the United States, China, Russia, France, and the United Kingdom, was the World War II victor group in 1945. They wrote into the rules of the UN, incidentally, that they would be the permanent Security Council members and have a veto over any change in the UN Charter. So it's really a group that gave itself power that the other 188 countries of the world look on and say, what is this? We need change. I would say the country that is most amazed and frustrated by this, in fact, is India. India is now the most populous country in the world. The United States has 335 million, roughly, in the population. Britain, France, roughly 60 million. India, 1.4 billion, not on the Security Council, a nuclear power, a world superpower, the president of the G20 this year, really not happy about that. Brazil, the largest economy of South America, similarly not on the Security Council. So this has been an issue for more than 20 years. The P5 in various ways have blocked particular countries, but added up, the P5 have said, you know what, this is our club. We want to stay as the permanent five. But I think as we really face the reality of it's not just a post-US dominated world, but actually a post-Western dominated world, because it was the US as the dominant power among the so-called West, which means the US, Britain, European Union, and honorary Western membership, Japan, let's say. But we're post-Western as well as post-US in dominance. And these international institutions will need to change, or they won't function in the 21st century. And if they don't function, it's actually a disaster for us. If they didn't exist, we'd have to make them because we need them to function. So we also need to renovate them.
I wanted to talk about China negotiating these various agreements. Let's turn to Brazil's President Luiz Inácio Lula da Silva, speaking before his meeting with Chinese President Xi Jinping.
What does Putin want? Putin can't keep Ukraine's territory. Maybe we don't even discuss Crimea, but he will have to rethink what he has invaded. Also, Zelensky can't have everything he wants to demand. NATO will not be able to set itself up at the border, so this is something we have to put on the table.
Eu acho que essa guerra já passou da conta. O Brasil já fez a crítica que tinha que fazer.
I think this war has dragged on for too long. Brazil has already criticized what it had to criticize. Brazil defends each nation's territorial integrity, so we disagree with Russia's invasion of Ukraine.
Because it looks like Ukraine is on the verge of a major counteroffensive against Russia. And in order to do this, needs massive support from Western countries, meaning military weapons. Can you talk about what China's role is here, the peace plan it has put forward, but also these other deals that China is helping to negotiate, like the successful rapprochement between Saudi Arabia and Iran, and then what they're suggesting about Israel and Palestine?
President Lula uttered in a few words the core of this issue that most of our media dare not explain to the American people, and that is the expansion of NATO. This is a war fundamentally about the U.S. attempt to expand a U.S. military alliance to Ukraine and to Georgia. Georgia is a country in the Caucasus, also on the Black Sea. The U.S. strategy, going back decades, has been to surround Russia in the Black Sea, with Ukraine, Romania, Bulgaria, Turkey, and Georgia, all NATO members surrounding Russia and its naval fleet in the Black Sea, with a naval fleet that has been the Black Sea naval fleet of Russia since 1783. Russia has said, this is our red line, and it has said that for decades. And it said this clearly in 2007, before George W. Bush Jr. had I'll call it the harebrained idea to announce in 2008 and force NATO to announce that Ukraine will be a member of NATO. And this is what President Lula was saying, and what President Xi Jinping of China has been saying. We can't have a war that is essentially a proxy war between Russia and the United States over the expansion of the U.S. military alliance right up to a 1,200 kilometer and more border with Russia, which Russia views, and I would say understandably views, as a fundamental national security threat to Russia. Keep some space, keep some distance. That's President Lula's meaning. That's what China means when it says in its peace plan, we want a peace plan that respects the security interests of all parties. What that is code word for saying, make peace, end the war, but don't expand NATO right up to the border. The American people have not heard an explanation of this all along. It's shocking to me because as a close observer of this for 30 years, this has been the casus belli. And yet our newspapers won't even report the background to this. But this is why China, South Africa, India, Brazil are saying we want peace, but we don't want NATO expansion as the meaning of so-called peace. We want the big superpowers to give each other some space and some distance so that the world isn't on a knife edge. That's exactly what President Lula was saying, and it's exactly what the meaning of the Chinese peace initiative is to say, yes, absolutely make peace, protect Ukraine's sovereignty and its security, but no to NATO expansion. But the Biden administration won't even discuss this issue. That has been the major failing and the reason why we have not been able to get to the negotiating table, in my opinion. Even when Zelensky said in March 2022, maybe not NATO, maybe something else, Russia and Ukraine were close to an agreement, and the United States intervened with Ukraine and said, we don't think that's a good agreement, because the U.S. neocons, so-called, have been pushing for NATO enlargement as the core of this issue. But this goes back to the more general point for us, which is that what is at stake in Ukraine and over Taiwan and many other issues from the point of view of China or Russia or other countries, including Brazil, now Saudi Arabia, Iran, and others, is whether the U.S. does what it wants to do or whether the U.S. respects some limits based on what other countries say, well, this is what we think, so that we need true multipolarity, not U.S. dominance alone. Rules written by all of us, not rules written just by the United States.
And Jeff Sachs, we only have a few, about a minute left, but I was wondering if you could comment on the parallels between this expansion of NATO further and further east in Europe. This year marks the 200th anniversary of the Monroe Doctrine, of President Monroe declaring to all the European powers that the Western Hemisphere was off limits to them attempting to move their forces and their militaries into Latin America. And for these past 200 years, Latin America has essentially been the major sphere of influence of the United States. And yet here we are saying that Russia has no right to declare that its immediate the countries immediately its borders cannot welcome in NATO troops.
Well, yes, a little empathy would go a long way and would have spared us actually a lot of wars. But for Americans, it would be useful to think, suppose Mexico made a military alliance with China. Would the United States say, well, that's Mexico's right, what are we going to do about it? Or might there be actually an invasion in short order or something like that? I would strongly advise to China and Mexico, don't try it at home. Don't experiment with this. But the United States government refuses that empathy because, in other words, refuses to put itself in the position of the other side. That's the fundamental arrogance of thinking that you determine the rules of the world. The problem with arrogance is not only the comeuppance from it, but you stumble into terrible crises that you don't even understand because the United States has not been allowed, the public has not been allowed to even think from the perspective of the other side. So the analogy is actually a very, very clear analogy. It is what China and Russia and others say all the time is, why have those double standards? Why don't we actually deal with each other with mutual respect, not with the rules that you write? No, we're definitely in rough waters. We're in a crisis. The crisis will get worse in the coming months, and it could get far worse. We're experiencing stagflation, meaning that there are rising prices at the same time that output is falling in many parts of the world. Europe is already in a downturn. The United States is entering a downturn. China is in some kind of economic downturn. So this is a global economic crisis. And so I regard the overall economic situation as bad as I've seen in decades, worse than in 2008. We're likely to experience some very significant shocks in the months ahead. Of course, the most crucial question is what happens to geopolitics? Does war spread? Does it intensify? Does it diminish? Is there a return to the negotiating table? Do the US and China come to blows which would disrupt global society? Do they find a way to talk with each other? These are the questions that we're facing right now.
It's true that this is all also happening on the backdrop of an immense debt leverage that the global economy. What do you think is the optimal solution to the current global debt overhang? And by debt, I mean private,
Everything.
public, everything. I'm just rounding up. I don't even want to think about the figure because it's too many zeros. So what's the solution to that so it doesn't threaten the world's global financial system and stability?
It's a great question. Again, in the last stagflation that we had in the late 1970s, what happened was that the inflation in the United States reached around 10% per year, and the Fed, under a 6'7", a 2-meter chairman of the Fed, Paul Volcker, cigar smoking, tough guy. He said, we're going to end this inflation. And he put interest rates up to 20%. And by the time it was over, all the developing countries were bankrupt. It was unbelievable. Well, it made my career because I spent the next decade helping countries get out of debt crisis, which had laid them completely flat. So if we go into this just with a naive financial squeeze right now, we'll end up with a lot of carnage, meaning a lot of countries in default, a lot of very high inflation rates. You look at a country like Turkey now. They have not managed their economy properly for years, but the inflation rate is reaching 100% per year right now. Argentina, the inflation rate is reaching 100%. There will be other countries experiencing this kind of runaway inflation. Maybe Ukraine is going to have a hyperinflation by the end of this crisis. Of course, we don't know.
But unlike 30 years ago or 40 years ago, actually, well, almost 50 to be exact, is the developed world, are the developed economies and their financial system insulated from this impact that could be coming again from emerging markets or developing economies?
It's interesting, you know, of course, in the 2010s, because the European Central Bank did not do a very good job under its president Trichet in the early years of the last decade, Greece nearly went bankrupt. And it wasn't so far for Ireland, Spain, Portugal, and even Italy. And so the Eurozone and Slovenia, the Eurozone almost collapsed. And it required Draghi's deft hand to prevent that collapse. Basically, the European Central Bank had to act as a lender of last resort to prevent a disaster. So central banks and their wisdom or lack of wisdom will determine a lot. In 2008, the Fed and the US Treasury stupidly drove Lehman Brothers into a bankruptcy one weekend in September 2008, and it cost the whole world trillions of dollars, that technical mistake that they made. And so when you're in a crisis, the first thing to say is these institutions are not so reliable. They're not so smart. They're not so foolproof that they necessarily avoid real damage. What we need to come to the positive answer to your question is we need to avoid a contagion of defaults and a contagion of insolvencies. And we also need to avoid simply telling dozens of countries, you need to contract sharply your public investment and your social spending and so forth.
So you effectively coming full circle from what, being the sort of from professing shock therapies, you are coming full circle into actually going against these sort of fiscal cuts in the country.
No. Remember, when I was advocating shock therapy, I was advocating that governments not print money or issue money in order to finance budget deficits. But I was constantly recommending that the international finance help the countries to avoid defaults or crises. One of the key pillars of shock therapy in Bolivia and Poland, for example, was a cancellation of the debts of those countries, the foreign debts. So I argued that to pay the foreign debts in Bolivia would have condemned the country to a rampant hyperinflation. And in the end, Bolivia's external debt to international banks was cut by about 90% at my recommendation. Similarly, in Poland, in that shock therapy, I recommended that Poland's debt overhang should be relieved. The debt that Poland owed, especially to its official creditors, should be cut very, very sharply, and that indeed happened. So I did not recommend simply austerity and contraction. I recommended always that the international counterparts, the creditors, play a role, a constructive role, a positive role in preventing crisis in the debtor countries.
And in debt relief, regardless the potential risk of moral hazard
debt relief depends on the circumstances. In the circumstances today, I'm not recommending cancellation of the face value of debts. What I am recommending is that one way or another, and it depends very much on the specific circumstances, that countries get the kinds of development finance that they need, even on a larger scale than now. And I'm talking about new debts on a long-term, low-interest rate basis so that these countries can continue to develop without going into default today. It's a tricky proposition for countries that have borrowed on the Eurobond market, governments that owe money right now. It may be that they have to say to the creditors, well, we need to extend the horizon for repayment under certain kinds of contracts where there are collective action clauses. This can be done fairly smoothly, and probably many countries are going to have to take that chance. When it comes to official credits that a government owes to a rich country government or to the World Bank or to some other international institution, I'm recommending a set of measures to make sure that the developing countries are getting more finance in fresh form than they are repaying on old debts. There are many ways to do that, but I'm basically saying don't print money. I've never believed in that because you just get high inflation, but rather let's get a financial solution that doesn't condemn the country to default or to bankruptcy or to extreme austerity. That's actually always been my policy recommendation since I started this approach in Bolivia in 1985.
And is it achievable under the current circumstances when the US Fed is fighting a 40-year high inflation and has been pushing up interest rates higher to the unprecedented high for, let's say, several decades going back, because that's actually been increasing the debt load or debt gearing of and debt servicing costs for all the EMs or developing countries?
It's going to be a close call for several reasons, but let me put it this way. Currently, the 30-year bond rate of the U.S. Treasury is about 3.2%, still quite low. The 30-year bond rate for German debt is still around 1%, actually. The 30-year bond rate for Ghana or for an emerging economy, if they can get a 30-year loan, is 10%. In other words, I am advocating a significant increase of official financing at interest rates that the Treasury or the German government or other Eurozone countries pay themselves. The real room for maneuver is that the interest rates paid by the high-income countries are still very low compared to what the emerging market economies face. What I'm suggesting, therefore, is a major expansion of funds coming from the World Bank, the European Investment Bank, the African Development Bank, the Asian Development Bank, that essentially can borrow on terms very close to what the US government or German government or Japanese government can borrow at, and therefore lend at quite low and long-term interest rates to emerging markets that, if they are left on their own, face horrendous terms that would drive them into default.
And then we are back into the whole idea of the currently lack of cooperation will on the global level. We have to get back to
there you go. So I'm recommending to the G20 this approach. But is there a G20 even right now? Countries are barely talking to each other. The US and Russia literally are not talking to each other, of course. US and China barely talking to each other and cooperating on something as bold as avoiding a financial crisis. Somehow it's not going well. And for me, all through my career, even when I didn't understand it properly at the time, it has been determined by geopolitics. Will something work or won't it work? Because you need cooperation. If the cooperative environment is there, a lot can get done. If there is no cooperation, the chance for a contagion is very, very real. This, I think, is what we face right now.
I have a last question on this topic. The ECB is facing a real difficult times and dilemma. Even, I mean, it's behind the tightening curve, launched by the Fed earlier in the season. What can ECB do to actually, put its policies back straight on the right course of sustaining that kind of development and preventing any global financial crisis, or maybe world financial crisis number 2 following 2008, 2009?
Well, I think Europe is in an extremely difficult situation, not mainly because of the ECB, but mainly because of the war in Ukraine and the vulnerability on energy, obviously. Europe's already in a downturn. It could get quite severe in the coming months. My position on this is not popular in Europe among the politicians, but as I've emphasized, my position is that there is a negotiated way out of this. I don't believe the NATO line that, well, we're just going to fight till we defeat Putin. If that is the approach, I don't think it's going to succeed on the battlefield. And I also think that the consequences economically will become quite unmanageable. The crisis will be very serious in my view. Now, maybe I'm too pessimistic, but I believe that the energy crisis and all of the uncertainties around it, and all of the other ramifications, and you compound that with the growing break with China as well, I think it will lead to a very significant crisis in Europe. And since we see the politics are already quite unstable in a number of countries, including Italy, for example, where the Draghi government has just fallen, and who knows what will happen next with elections coming up. I think that the chance of revisiting a deep Eurozone crisis becomes very real. So I don't see the pieces working very well right now. And the ECB can only do so much in this context. I think it's going to have an extremely difficult time unless we find a way to peace and to easing the very, very high tensions right now.
You are viewed, and correct me if I'm wrong, as the co-author or co-father of the United Nations development goals that are used in the currently, often discussed ESG policies. And you are the Columbia University director of the Center for Sustainable Development. And what does it mean? What is your typical day like in this role?
Great question. Typically, it's Zooming from early morning till late at night, because now in our digital world, we can meet and speak all over the world rather conveniently.
And do it sustainably.
And do it depending on how exactly the electricity is provided for our Zooms. That remains a question, but it's much more sustainable than getting on an airplane for every meeting that one has to have. I spend a tremendous amount of my day, every day, working on the Sustainable Development Goals and the Paris Climate Agreement. I believe, as I've been emphasizing, that global cooperation is necessary, is vital, and is feasible. I don't believe in a divided world. I don't believe in democracies versus autocracies. I don't believe in cold wars or hot wars. I believe that our environmental and social crises are so severe that we need cooperation right now above all of the differences that we might suppose to divide the world. And so I speak with the Chinese, I speak with Latin America, African leaders, European leaders, all the time. And I promote solutions, as we discussed, for the financial crisis, which is deepening, for the climate crisis, which is deepening. And I help to lead a network of more than 1,500 universities around the world to address, through education and research and policy analysis, how to promote sustainable development. And war is my enemy, obviously, because it's the biggest distraction. It sucks up all the energy. It destroys so much faster than we can possibly build. It undermines every opportunity for trust and partnership. So these days I spend a tremendous amount of time trying to see, is there some way to overcome this two-front crisis that we face with Russia and China against the US and its alliance. And I always appeal for Europe to be smarter in its diplomacy, because Europe has the values of sustainable development, yet it's caught in war. And I want to see Europe get out of this trap of war, not fall into a trap of a new battle with China, and help lead the way to a cooperative approach to sustainable development.
How do you see the latest efforts by US and EU authorities in sort of codifying the ESG rules. How do you see the current approach to that? Whether it should be sort of more better codified from the above rather than sort of driven from below by the markets?
It definitely, we need top-down codification and top-down policies. And very broadly speaking, the European Green Deal is a valid, smart, I would say sophisticated approach. It's got many limitations, but the European Green Deal is a framework that the 27 have adopted. It can serve as a roadmap. It's not exactly a plan, of course, and there are 1,000 details to be argued every day. Is natural gas really green? Is nuclear green? And so on. So these are inevitable points of debate. But broadly speaking, the European Green Deal is well done and well worth achieving and well worth promoting diplomatically to say to the Latin American countries, to the African Union, to ASEAN, and so on, you need a Green Deal the same way we have a Green Deal. Europe could really provide a lot of leadership that way.
When it comes to the Green Deal taxonomy, what's really important for the Czech Republic and even some other Central European countries, do you think that the nuclear power should be viewed as sustainable going forward? And that Germany should actually bring its, sort of reverse its policy of shutting down nuclear power plants?
I think nuclear power, if, and this is a big if it can be managed safely so that with the absolute state-of-the-art safety systems, especially passive safety systems, offers a component of the zero carbon energy system. I don't believe, I'm not myself a purist that says absolutely no to nuclear power. Of course, it raises many issues, fissile materials, nuclear safety, nuclear waste, and the alternatives, because if you could do it without nuclear through efficient, an efficient system of wind, solar, hydro, and so forth, there's a lot of merit to that. But I think within the practical context, there's no doubt that nuclear power is going to continue to play its role, obviously in France, obviously in Central Europe, obviously in China, in Korea, in
Ukraine,
a lot of
in
countries
Russia.
in the world. Well, in Russia and Ukraine, I would expect so also, absolutely. I'm in what is called the World Economic Outlook. You can go to imf.org and just look at the data, which I do 10 times a day for my job. And if you look at the purchasing power adjusted prices, China is about 30% larger than the United States in absolute size. So 1.3 divided by 4, because the population is 4 times larger. So in per person terms, about 30% or 35% of the US. China's poorer per capita than the United States, but it's a big economy because 1.4 billion people is a lot more than 335 million people, which is the US population. Now, that's freaking out the policymakers in the US. They're bigger. How dare they be bigger? But it's kind of arithmetic. The only way that China could be smaller than the US is to stay at a per capita income less than a fourth of America. But why should they? Because China's filled with clever people, with good entrepreneurs, with technology. Technology flows in this world. It always has, and it will continue to. And China now is absolutely in the front ranks of scientific breakthroughs and of technological innovation, arguably ahead in many, many sectors, comparable in many and behind in some, but a superpower in science and technology, and with superb universities
and all of the things that make for a high-income country. And why not? China was the world leader for 1,000 years at least. It lost that lead by a terrible policy error in the year 1434 when the Ming court stopped the great fleet of Admiral Zheng He, and China went protectionist, and the next time it was really deeply exposed to the world is when British steamers were coming up the river to bomb the Qing imperial properties in the First Opium War. So China is going to be successful, and it's not going to stay at less than a quarter of US per capita income. It's going to continue to grow. And incidentally, you read these days op-eds, oh, China's miracle's over, China's finished, the Chinese economy's collapsing. This is so ignorant, I can't even tell you. China, by the way, will have business cycles like the United States does. It will have financial booms and busts. Nobody has figured out how to avoid financial crises in the last 300 years of market economy. So China no doubt has too much debt in some cities and in some real estate enterprises, no doubt. But China's going to continue to grow, and it's going to continue to narrow the gap with the United States in per capita terms. It's going to be bigger than the United States in absolute terms. It already is by one good measure, and it will be by the other good measure without doubt, unless there's global calamity of some sort, which I'm putting aside for the moment. And so the whole idea of American grand strategy is really messed up. And that is one large part of our problem right now. What Blackwell and Tellis recommended in this essay in 2015 or 2016, and when you read something on the Council on Foreign Relations, usually what's written is already policy, so it's letting the public know what the thinking in Washington is. It's not really even a trial balloon. It's already what's established. Blackwell says that China's rise is no longer in America's interest, and then there's a list of things that should be done. We should use trade policy to stop China's export growth. We should restrict the flow of technology to China. We should bolster our military alliances along the Pacific Rim countries. We should form trade groups in Asia that don't include China. One of the weirdest ideas imaginable, by the way. If they would ever look at a map, they would see that this is not really the most sensible idea in the world. But grown-ups in Washington, they're physically grown-ups. They actually did this. This was the whole idea of the TPP. Stupider, I can't imagine. But we have grown-ups that say, let's have a trade agreement in Asia where China's the lead trade partner of every one of the countries, and clever us, we won't include China. Okay, this is what passes for public policy. So Blackwell listed all the things that we should do, and we're doing all of them. First, in the instability of the Trump period, where there's a lot of noise to signal, so you never knew day to day what was really going on, nor did anyone else, including the president. But he started this process of unilateral trade measures and barking at China and generally trying to raise tensions. And then Biden came in, and I thought there would be some more grown-up behavior, as I said, and actually it got worse because it became more systematic, more systematically wrong. So what Biden did is just going through the list that Blackwell set out in 2016 or 2015, which is all the measures one takes of containment. And this is, one should understand, this is the third round of American policy in this regard. It was invented for the Soviet Union, and it was deployed in the 1950s vis-a-vis the Soviet Union. And then, interestingly, it was deployed in a lighter way against Japan at the end of the 1980s and early 1990s, because Japan became so successful that even though Japan was our ally and has no army and everything else, Japan basically became an enemy in economic terms, and the United States landed very heavily on Japan and said, you can't export anymore to us, and you have to agree to that, you have to overvalue your currency by 50%, and you have to do all sorts of things because we're not going to let you continue to have the success. And we stopped Japanese growth. So this is the third try of this. But China's not Japan. Japan is 125 million people, and China's 1.4 billion people, and Japan is under the US security umbrella, and China is an independent superpower, and it's not going to sit still the way that Japan did in the early 1990s. China's going to figure out its way around all of this. But that was a big part of what we're seeing right now. So in a deep sense, Mearsheimer was right. China did nothing special to provoke any of this other than achieving rapid economic growth and economic progress. I see nothing extraordinary. Of course, every claim of China's success is they stole it from us, they cheated. This is both fantasy and prejudice mixed together with the fact that everybody steals a bit from everybody else, so there was nothing special about what China did. But in any event, it is the playbook, contain China, and that's a big part of what's going on. There's one other part of what's happening in our relationship, which is more economic, but also playing a role. And that is that when China achieved its economic success, heavily based on export-led growth, and heavily based on export-led growth to the US market, just as Adam Smith said, this made the US richer, it made China richer, it was a win-win proposition, the strong interrelations of China and the United States. But what you learn from trade history and trade theory, both, is that a win-win proposition at the aggregate level, that the US became a richer economy because China was becoming a richer economy, also went alongside inequalities within the United States, some of which arose from trade itself. So in international trade, there are losers as well as winners. The most basic theorem of international trade, going back to Smith and David Ricardo and Paul Samuelson in the 20th century, is that the winners win more than the losers lose, so that the overall size of the economy grows. And for everybody to win from trade, the winners should compensate the losers. So the idea is a growing economy, which the US has had, should be enough for everybody to rise in that economy. But instead, there are pockets in our, not just pockets in our society, significant parts of our society that are not rising, they're falling. So the US has become very rich, and the rich part of the United States has become really rich. And there are two parts of our society that are hurting. One is specifically places that are in the import competition with China, and that is the Midwest to an important extent. And those happen to be swing states in presidential elections. So Wisconsin, Minnesota, Ohio, my home state of Michigan, Indiana, Pennsylvania, and so forth. A lot of places there were hit by very high quality, low cost Chinese manufactured exports. And the second part of our society that's been hit in general is people with educational attainment of high school or less, because our society's absolutely diverged between university education and high school education on every dimension of well-being, including life expectancy, including health, including income levels, and so on. Now, in international trade theory and practice, the winners should help the losers. But we're a kind of nasty society. I think I would like to make that clear. Our political system was invented in the British mode of John Locke. John Locke, the philosopher at the end of the 17th century. And John Locke's idea was that you own your own labor and nobody should take it away from you. And that is pretty deeply embedded in the American psyche, which is, that's mine, thank you. And I don't want to be taxed. And we are a low-tax society that complains endlessly about taxes. That's the American tradition. In fact, there would be no United States of America other than for a tax revolt. The British wanted to put a little bit of tax on the Americans to help pay for the post-1763 costs after the 7 Years' War, and the colonists said, hell no, we don't have to pay any taxes, and no taxes without representation, and by the way, no taxes with representation is the American way as well, because our Congress is bought off by rich people who tell them, don't you dare ever charge us more taxes. That's how the American political system works. So, simply, the winners don't like to compensate the losers in the United States. In fact, they like to say, you're losers. And so Trump ran on this basis instead of running on what a nice party in Europe would run on, a social democratic platform that says, you know, we're all one society and we're awfully rich, and we should make sure that even if you lose your job, you have health care, and college education is too expensive, so we'll make sure that it's affordable. That's what a nice place would do. What Trump ran on was something completely different. He ran on tax cuts for the rich, and China is the one causing you all this. You see? Thank you, Donald. China's the one causing you all this pain. They stole your jobs. And I'm never going to let them get away with that. And so intersecting with our grand strategy, which is ridiculous, is the protectionism that comes from a society in which winners don't compensate losers, but winners deflect the blame by blaming foreigners. And Trump's whole campaign was, you can blame everyone else except rich people. Rich people we give tax cuts to, but blame the people coming up from the border from Mexico, or blame the Chinese, or blame the foreigners. That plays well. It makes a nasty society even nastier and more disorganized and disoriented, and he did a very good job of that. And the Democrats, what used to be my party before I decisively left it, I have no home politically. I'm just disgusted by all of it. The Democrats learned the lesson of 2016, which is, oh, protectionism is the way to win power. So the Democrats are always learning from the Republicans. They learned from the Republicans in the 1980s, always advocate for tax cuts. That's how Reagan became so popular. And then the Democrat, and remember, well, you don't remember, but if you're as old as I am, you remember Walter Mondale said, he's going to raise taxes, I'm going to raise taxes, he's going to raise taxes too, he just won't tell you. And Mondale lost 49 states by saying that. And since then, no Democrat has said, we'll raise taxes. They just follow the Republicans. Then it used to be that the Republicans were free traders, and then Trump cleverly exploited the widening inequalities in the United States and turned it into an anti-China protectionism. And then the Democrats have learned that too. So, and then we have our grand strategist of our day, Jake Sullivan, who put the two pieces together and said, we can be protectionist and use this to contain China and win elections, and he's made a huge mess of everything by basically advising and helping to guide a policy where Biden came in and decided to double down on the anti-China sentiment and the anti-China policies. So in the first year of the administration, where I had a lot of former friends, they're not my friends anymore, I mean, I like them still, they don't like me anymore. But anyway, I said, oh, now reach out to your counterparts. We know all the technocrats in China, all the economic technocrats, of course, because we trained a lot of them. They're our students. They're friends for 30 years or 40 years. They said, no, the White House has said no contact. You can't have contact. We're reviewing our China policy. So for the first year, there was no discussion, basically. Even at the technocratic level, it was amazing. So wrong-headed, by the way. As an academic, I could keep all the contacts, talk to people, see friends, visit Beijing before COVID hit, and at least keep open channels. But the administration, no open channels at all. And then the idea was the tension must be good for our politics. We'll show how tough we are. We'll continue containment. We'll be more protectionist. We'll have a build in America policy, which is what what Biden is trying to do with the Infrastructure Act and the Inflation Reduction Act and so forth. And that is how things went, basically until about 6 months ago. I would add in Nancy Pelosi's absolutely absurd and reckless trip to Taipei. You just can't imagine more irresponsibility than that, in my opinion. And she is enormously irresponsible and just playing for the home crowd. But she went, and so Taiwan is added to this, and President Tsai in Taiwan has also been, in my opinion, irresponsible by rhetoric that is very loose, very dangerous, and in the midst of all of these other tensions, just raising the stakes in a way that allow our worst hotheads, and if you want our very worst hothead, it's Lindsey Graham, dumber you cannot get, and more militaristic you cannot get. He wants war everywhere. This week it's with Iran, but before that it was with China, before that it was with Russia. So this is really our state of affairs, that the protectionism, the grand strategy, the irresponsibility of Washington politicians, I think created all of this. I can't see, China made one mistake, by the way, rhetorically. And that was in 2014 when China launched the Made in China 2025 policy, which is a very smart policy calling for China to become leader in technology in 10 major areas. China said not that we want to advance in these areas. China said we want to dominate in these areas. We want to lead in these areas. That was not a good idea. It would have been much smarter to say, we want to advance in these areas. We could have saved a lot of grief by a different kind of rhetoric. So this is my basic interpretation of where we are right now. I said that it came to about 6 months ago when things were really boiling. I mean, very dangerous. The balloon incident, the war in Ukraine going not the way that the United States wanted or expected, another debacle of U.S. foreign policy, terrible debacle, because that's a war that never should have happened, and it was a war caused by this relentless idea of NATO enlargement to Ukraine, which is, talk about red lines. It's like Taiwan, but from Russia's point of view. You don't put the U.S. military on the Ukraine-Russia border, and they couldn't figure that out because they're not very clever at thinking through the eyes of the other side. So 6 months ago, things were really getting out of hand, and here we are. I think they decided about 6 months ago, this is not good. We need to start dialing back. And so that's why several of our cabinet secretaries went to China, why the rhetoric was toned down. Still, they can't quite calibrate this, because even when, say, Janet Yellen went, and she was saying we want good relations, Biden was at the same time signing another unilateral executive order to tighten the restrictions on technology exports to China. So we can't so far sustain quiet and calm. But I think the intention right now is, with an overloaded U.S. foreign policy, a failing war in Ukraine, a disaster in the Middle East, a president that's very unpopular, running against a probable convicted felon. It's a great scene. They want not so much tension in the next 12 months, and I think that that is the goal right now. And since there's no deep reason for this conflict, other than the ones that I've described, it would not be hard to dial back the tensions. It's not as if we are at dire loggerheads over anything real. We are in a constructed confrontation out of mindsets, not out of direct clash of interests. So finally, I am late and have to go and am hogging the mic. China will have its ups and downs, but the main direction is not like that. The main direction is up. The most basic thing to watch is education, technology, and innovation. And on that, China's in the first ranks. And for an economy at China's level of development, that's the key. And that's not going away. That's going to continue. And China is leader, rightly, in many important technologies for the next 30 years, in digital technologies, in electric vehicles, in renewable energy, and many, many things. And the U.S. might continue to try to contain China, but it can't do it. Even the technology cutoffs will not have much effect at all. China's busy innovating around the microchips, and I would not worry too much about that. And if the U.S. blocks the U.S. market for China's goods, there's a whole world outside of the U.S. that wants Chinese goods, and that's what the Belt and Road Initiative and other similar initiatives of China, like the BRICS expansion, are after. So all in all, China will continue to develop. We should view that absolutely positively. It means better lives for the Chinese people. It means better opportunities for the world economy. It's better for the United States. China's progress is plus for the United States, and we should try to help our politicians make sense. Thank you very much.
God, this is supposedly our ally who would end the world. We better negotiate. We better speed up the negotiations because this is not stable. And when Zelensky says these things, I'm horrified. And yeah, they walked it back, but he didn't say sanctions, by the way. He said preemptive strike, and Zelensky has said similar things. And they talk recklessly, maybe understandably given their circumstance. I don't think so. I don't like it. And I think it shows how unstable this is. And by the way, during this whole period of this proxy war, where this is really a confrontation between Russia and the United States, we have pretended that it's a confrontation only between Russia and Ukraine, first of all. And we've said constantly, whatever Ukraine says, this is, that's the right thing. And so we're kind of giving carte blanche to the most extravagant, dangerous, provocative statements. And another example, okay, we don't know for 100%, but let me do a little quiz. Russia is in control right now of the Zaporozhye nuclear power plant. It is being shelled. We hear that's very dangerous, which it is. You shouldn't shell nuclear power plants. Now, one side controls the plant. So who is actually shelling the plant? Well, our media say, oh, we don't know who's shelling the plant. And they can't put one and one together to say, well, if Russia's in control of the plant, maybe they're not shelling their own plant. Maybe it's Ukraine shelling the plant. Well, I can tell you, I speak to a lot of people. It's almost surely Ukraine shelling the power plant. And we can't bring ourselves to express a simple truth. And that hurts because they continue to shell the power plant with impunity. And we should say, stop shelling the power plant. Yes, it would be good if you had control of the power plant, we can say to them, but don't shell a nuclear power plant. But we can't even find those words. That's the problem, because we're kind of faking the whole thing as if this isn't a US-Russia thing. Then we say, okay, do it, go, defeat Putin, that's great, that's what we want. Defeat the guy with 1,600 active nuclear warheads and several thousand more in reserve. Go ahead, go do it. As if this isn't our Armageddon that we're heading to. And that's really been a massive failure of this administration till now. One thing I've learned I'm 67 years old. I've been through a lot of US wars. Vietnam, Laos, Cambodia, Nicaragua, Iraq, Syria, Afghanistan, Libya, Yemen, and more. It's the job of the President of the United States to put on the brakes, because this country is a war machine at the top. We don't see it. We don't know it exactly. Eisenhower told us about it with the military-industrial complex. This country is a war machine. The main job of the President of the United States is to stop the war machine from making wars. And we are now in an escalation heading towards Armageddon, according to the President. That's not a spectator sport. That's his job, to keep us away from Armageddon.
And Professor Sachs, you said this is a war between the U.S. and Russia. We've heard threat after threat or call after call for an end to the Nord Stream 2 pipeline from Assistant Secretary of State Victoria Nuland to Joe Biden himself. Senator Ron Johnson, in questioning Nuland, appeared to actually call for the sabotage of the pipeline.
But I'm literally talking about rolling back the pipeline. You can loosely define that, but I mean taking action that will prevent it from ever becoming operational.
So who do you think is responsible for the worst act of industrial sabotage in recent memory and maybe in long memory? And what would their motive be, considering that the German economy was on the hook here?
You know, I've said I wasn't there, but my guess is, just like I think Ukraine is shelling the Zaporozhye nuclear power plant, I think the United States blew up Nord Stream. And they told us, Biden said it in February, said if Putin invades, Nord Stream is over. And then a reporter said, well, what do you mean, Mr. President? How are you going to do that? He said, we have our ways. We have our ways.
We will bring an end to it.
How will you do that exactly, since the project and control of the project is within Germany's control?
We will, I promise you, we'll be able to do it.
Come on. Who controls the airspace? Who monitors the airspace? Who has the means to do this? Who said we're going to do it? Who said afterwards, this is a tremendous opportunity, this new situation, a tremendous opportunity to permanently wean Europe from Russian gas? That would be Secretary of State Blinken. Who said, thank you, USA, tweeting a picture of the burst pipeline? That would be Radek Sikorski, former foreign minister of Poland. And by the way, I've been in touch with reporters in papers that say we don't know, or even worse, who say Russia did this. And then I talk to very senior reporters, and they say, Jeff, of course it's the U.S. What do you think? But it doesn't get into our news. My guess is that we're going to hear from Europe's investigators in a week or so. Very hard. We don't know. Trail went cold. Very hard to tell. We'll keep looking, but we don't know. But terrible blow, terrible blow. That would be consistent with the U.S. doing it. And the fact that things went a bit quiet after this, rather than parliamentarians throughout Europe demanding our core infrastructure was blown up, tells me that they're told, keep it quiet, keep it quiet. We don't really want to know exactly what happened. So I can't prove this, but it sure does, to my mind, put all the suspicion on the U.S. side. Warnings, motive, capability, subsequent behavior, strange statements. To my mind, it adds up. I don't think Russia would blow up its core infrastructure. That doesn't make sense. And anyone else that did it would, with Poland or Denmark or anyone else, that would be NATO, that would be with the US.
President Joe Biden has said, Professor Sachs, that there will be an investigation into what he has deemed an act of deliberate sabotage. He said he'll send divers down, which is interesting because he knows that divers can reach it. But do you think that this investigation will be a whitewash like the kind we saw the Organization for the Prohibition of Chemical Weapons carry out, where inspectors were actually censored and even attacked by OPCW leadership around the Duma Syria chemical weapon attack allegations in April 2018? And what do you make specifically of that allegation? My colleague here, Aaron Mate, has done as much to expose the cover-up as anyone, so it's a real issue of interest here.
Well, on this, the pipeline, the U.S. can't be the one investigating if the U.S. is the most likely culprit. I mean, they can, but we're not going to find any credibility in what comes out of this. So I think the idea of an independent and transparent investigation would be great, but I'm not holding my breath. So the U.S. may say something. Again, I'm 67 years old. Took me a long time to grow up to know that almost everything we hear is not true. We are a security state. We have a secret state, which runs most of our foreign and military policy, of course, and we don't hear the real thing. So I'm not putting too much stock in what the U.S. comes up with. I'm a little more curious about what the Europeans say. It's their infrastructure, after all. It's their economy. It's their gas pipeline. And you would think that they might be interested in actually knowing. But what's also true is that if they do find out or they do know, which I presume they do, they're not speaking also because, you know, the U.S. they think is their security umbrella. I think the U.S. is the great provocation that threatens Europe just about as much as anything right now. So I don't know if we'll ever find out the truth, but frankly, there are so many issues that we never find out the truth about because we never really look. And when you have a state based on secrecy and impunity and, like in Love Story, never having to say you're sorry, the CIA doesn't say, oh, we made a mistake, so sorry, let's have a careful review of what we've done. We're not going to find out about Syria. We're not going to find out about this, not from the U.S. at least. On Syria and the chemical weapons, I listen to you guys. I'm not enough of an expert or inside to know, but what I do know as a very basic point, the U.S., of course, really instigated the war in Syria in 2011. It was the plan, like 100 times before, to overthrow Assad. President Obama signed a presidential finding to task the CIA to work with Saudi Arabia and others to overthrow Assad. This was Operation Timber Sycamore. What is amazing to me about the whole thing is that there's almost not been any coverage, review, explanation of this. We heard only this is a civil war. That's what we heard again and again. And then we hear even more extraordinarily, Putin intervened in Syria. Look what the Russians have done. Putin intervened years after the US took action to overthrow Russia's ally. But we can't get this story told. I think the New York Times covered Operation Sycamore one day, if I remember, something around 2016. Nothing beforehand, nothing after. And I knew a lot about this in those years at the time because I knew what was happening through diplomatic channels and so forth. It was like reality here, weirdness of our mainstream media here, and a narrative that was completely devoid of facts for years. And newspapers that are, of course, absolutely counter-informative.
Quick question on Ukraine before we move on to other topics. What do you think guides the U.S. officials who are overseeing the current policy? I mean, we had someone like Lindsey Graham recently say that as long as the U.S. arms Ukraine, they will fight to the last person.
4 months into this thing, I like the structural path we're on here. As long as we help Ukraine with the weapons they need and the economic support, they will fight to the last person.
Do you think that's the prevailing mentality right now? And why are they so determined to sacrifice Ukraine in this war against Russia?
And if I could piggyback on that question, Professor Sachs, since you mentioned the Cuban Missile Crisis and your understanding of it, throughout the Cuban Missile Crisis, the Kennedy brothers, John F. Kennedy, Bobby Kennedy, were pushing back against the Joint Chiefs. Then later in Vietnam, although LBJ was going along with the Joint Chiefs, he was listening to character figures like George Ball, Assistant Secretary of State, who was an opponent of the war. Do you have any insight into the thinking of the Biden administration? And is there anyone there who is resisting this drive towards nuclear escalation?
I think that the core motivation of the U.S. goes back to the neocon approach to foreign policy, which basically has been the approach of the United States for 30 years now. At the end of the Soviet Union, the neocons took power. They're still in power. And their view is the U.S. is the unipolar power. It's the sole superpower, and we're going to keep it that way. And under U.S. strategic doctrines right now, there are two threats. Russia is one and China is the other. And it's not an accident that we're in confrontations on two fronts right now. So when it comes to Russia, Zbig Brzezinski pretty much spelled this out in his very interesting book, The Global Chessboard, Grand Chessboard, or Global Chessboard, 1997, where he said that Ukraine is the geographical pivot of Eurasia. It's the key. If the United States is basically in charge, Russia ceases to be even a regional power, basically. It's cut out from the Black Sea and the Eastern Mediterranean. Ukraine's a big prize if you're a neocon. If you know, and a neocon is someone who views the world like the game of Risk, that you want to get all your pieces on the board and you want to take all of your opponent's pieces off the board. And Ukraine is really strategic from their point of view. And this has been spelled out by Robert Kagan, for example. They've written about this quite openly. And of course, you know, that family has been part of this for the whole time, because Victoria Nuland is the Undersecretary of State for Political Affairs in the United States right now. She's been through this, through all these administrations. And so I think that this is the core, that we're going to expand NATO. They have the idea that the North Atlantic reaches to Georgia. Now, that's an interesting idea. That was George Bush's geographical insight in 2008. Extraordinarily cynical, but if you look at a map, what's the game plan? The game plan is control the Black Sea. It is Ukraine, Romania, Bulgaria, Turkey, and Georgia, all surrounding Russia, where their naval fleet is. So that's what Brzezinski was outlining back in 1997. Now, they thought they could kind of slip it in without, you know, Russia being able to oppose it, because they kept expanding NATO step by step. First, the three, Hungary, Poland, Czech Republic, by the way, against the promise, the clear, unequivocal promise to Gorbachev that NATO would not expand to the east. And like so many other things, the US government said, oh, we never said that. Well, they're liars. Of course they said it. And there's a full documentary record, easily accessible on the web, to understand what was said. So, long and the short of it is, that's been the game plan for 30 years. And it's had its ups and downs, because Ukraine itself is internally divided between East and West. And so the presidents have gone back and forth, pro-Russia, anti-Russia. And when a pro-Russian president, Viktor Yanukovych, came in 2010, after Bush had invited Ukraine into NATO, over the opposition, by the way, of European leaders, but this is a US-led alliance, Yanukovych guided neutrality through the Ukrainian parliament. That stabilized things for a little while, until Yanukovych was overthrown. Overthrown by whom? Well, according to the US narrative, the masses on the streets. According to what I saw with my own eyes, we stirred a lot of the pot and paid for a lot of that overthrow. I don't know how much. Everything's a lie. Everything's hidden. But the Russians say that was a coup that the US led. I can't tell you exactly the US role, but we heard Victoria Nuland on the tape describing the formation of the new government, and other choice words for our European allies. And I know with my own eyes, by the way, about US involvement in that. Not my involvement. I saw it. I was, oh my God, that's pretty weird what's going down. And this is Russia's point, which is, okay, you broke it again. Now, because as soon as Yanukovych went down, the new government said, we want NATO. And then the US started pouring in the weapons, billions of dollars, during the Trump years. Then Biden came and I thought, my God, maybe we'll get some sanity. Of course, he doubled down 3 times in 2021. At the highest levels, we said Ukraine will be a member of NATO in the NATO annual meeting, in a State Department strategic document with Ukraine, and in a Defense Department strategic document. So we doubled down. That's when I called the White House at the end of the year, please take the off-ramp. But they don't want to take the off-ramp. Now we're close to Armageddon, we're told. There is an off-ramp. We better take the off-ramp. We better start talking rather than just escalating.